What if I told you that um, taking your leftover white rice, just sealing it in a container, putting it in the refrigerator overnight, and then eating it the next day fundamentally alters its molecular structure?
It's wild.
Right. Like
Yeah.
it physically transforms from this fast-acting, high glycemic carb into a gut-healing, digestion-resisting fiber. And that's just from the temperature of your fridge.
Yeah, I mean, I know it sounds like total internet pseudoscience,
Oh, completely.
but it is actually one of the most fascinating thermodynamic realities of food chemistry.
Well, welcome to this custom-tailored deep dives created just for you. Today, our mission is to basically cut straight through all that highly polarizing, empty calorie noise surrounding a food that literally billions of people eat every single day.
Exactly. We're talking about white rice today.
White rice. And we are not using those tiny, contradictory 20-person dietary trials to do it. We have a massive stack of really rigorous sources in front of us.
Yeah, we are anchored by the landmark Puree study, which that tracked over 137,000 people across 21 countries.
That's huge.
It's massive, and we're looking at that alongside some major meta-analyses from the British Medical Journal.
And that scale is just crucial.
Right, because by relying on these, massive high-quality data sets, we can actually look at what white rice does to the human population at large. We're not getting bogged down by the noise of those small, heavily controlled lab experiments.
The ones that don't really reflect how people actually eat in the real world.
Exactly.
So we are going to find out exactly how white rice impacts your body, the specific varieties you should actually be buying, and how you can hack your cooking methods to make it, metabolically safer.
Yeah, the cooking hacks are incredible.
But to really grasp how to make it healthier, we have to kind of start at the beginning.
Right.
Like, what is actually happening in your body the moment you swallow a bite of standard, freshly cooked white rice?
So to understand the physiological response, you really have to look at the anatomy of the grain itself. White rice is, by definition, a refined product. In its natural state, like as brown rice, the grain is encased in this fibrous bran layer, and it contains a really nutrient-dense germ.
But those layers, they contain oils that can go rancid, right?
Yeah, exactly. So to extend the shelf life, and honestly to create a softer, more desirable texture, the grain is basically thoroughly milled and polished.
And that polishing process is essentially stripping away the grain's protective armor.
That's a great way to put it. And a lot of the nutritional value just goes right out the window with it.
Wow.
You lose about, I think it's 80 to 90% of the vitamin B1, 70% of the magnesium, and virtually all of the dietary fiber.
All the fiber's just gone.
Almost entirely.
Yeah.
What remains is the endosperm, which is just composed of starch.
So it's basically pure energy.
Yes. And because there is no fibrous bran left to act as a physical barrier, your digestive enzymes have immediate unrestricted access to that starch.
Okay.
The second it hits your small intestine, enzymes rapidly cleave those starch molecules into simple glucose. And then this glucose is absorbed through the intestinal wall directly into the portal vein, which is the main blood vessel that ferries nutrients straight to your liver.
And that is what causes the famous blood sugar spike.
Exactly.
To visualize this for you, listening at home, think about building a campfire.
Right.
Eating plain, freshly cooked white rice is like throwing highly flammable, bone-dry twigs onto a hot fire.
It just flares up.
It flares up instantly and violently. That's your glucose flooding the portal vein. And because you don't have any slow-burning logs on that fire, the fiber that was milled away, you have literally no way to control the burn.
That is a highly accurate way to picture it, yeah. And your body's response to that violent flare-up is to panic slightly.
Panic how?
Your pancreas is suddenly forced to secrete a massive surge of insulin to wrangle all that glucose out of the blood and shuttle it into your cells.
Which brings up some pretty stark numbers from the data, the 2012 BMJ meta-analysis. They synthesized data from over 352,000 participants.
Right.
And they found that for every additional daily serving of white rice you eat, the risk of developing type 2 diabetes increases by 11%.
Yeah, it's a significant number.
And a serving here is defined as about 158 grams, which is basically just one standard small bowl.
But, and this is a big but, we have to be very careful with that 11% figure.
Why is that?
Because it's just an average. It actually masks a massive demographic divide, something researchers often call the Asian paradox.
Wait, a paradox. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because if the data says an extra bowl raises diabetes risk, shouldn't that apply to everyone equally?
You would definitely think so, but the risk is actually highly contextual. It's based on geography, genetics, and honestly just sheer volume.
Okay.
In Western populations, the data shows that the diabetes risk from white rice consumption is practically negligible.
Negligible, really.
Yeah, but that's because in the West, rice is typically a side dish, eaten maybe once or twice a week.
Right. But in Asian populations, rice isn't just a side dish.
Yeah.
It is the foundational caloric staple. Like
Mhm.
billions of people eat it every single day. So what happens to the risk there?
It skyrockets. In Asian populations, we aren't talking about one bowl a week. We're talking about 3 to 4 servings a day.
Wow.
That is easily 450 to 600 grams of cooked rice, which is just a massive pile of carbohydrates.
That is.
And for those highest consumers, the risk of type 2 diabetes jumps by 55% compared to the lowest consumers.
A 55% increase. That is huge. Is that entirely just because they are eating more of it? Like purely a volume thing?
It's a combination. It's the sheer volume. So throwing dry twigs on the fire 4 times a day, every day, and underlying physiological differences.
Like what kind of differences?
Well, Asian demographics, generally speaking, tend to exhibit a higher baseline of insulin resistance at much lower body mass indexes compared to, say, European populations.
Interesting. Why is that?
It often comes down to body composition. Even at a lower overall body weight, there's a tendency to carry more visceral fat. That's the fat around the organs.
Right. The dangerous kind.
Exactly. More visceral fat and less skeletal muscle mass. And muscle is your body's primary sink for disposing of glucose.
Oh, I get it. So if you have less muscle mass to soak up the sugar
Right.
and more visceral fat driving insulin resistance, your pancreas just gets exhausted much faster from constantly dealing with those rapid flare-ups.
You nailed it. It just gets burnt out.
So if you are listening to this and you eat a massive amount of white rice daily, this sounds terrifying. Like, are you saying everyone needs to clear out their pantry and stop eating white rice completely?
Absolutely not. And I really want to stress that. This is exactly why we included the Pure E study in our sources today.
Yes, the huge one.
Right. That study, looking at 21 different countries and incredibly diverse populations, found absolutely zero significant association between white rice consumption and cardiovascular disease or overall mortality on a global scale.
Let me just underline that for you listening. Despite the localized diabetes risk at high volumes, eating white rice is not globally linked to heart attacks or dying earlier.
Correct. It is fundamentally safe. It's not a poison.
Right.
The issue is purely the metabolic toll of very high volumes in specific populations.
But since telling the whole world to, abandon their cultural staple isn't practical or even necessary, how do we mitigate that metabolic toll?
Right.
If we aren't going to stop eating white rice, how do we shop smarter?
This is where we have to look at the botanical structure of the grain itself. The glycemic impact of white rice, meaning how fast those twigs burn, comes down to the molecular architecture of its starch.
Okay, getting into the chemistry here.
Just a little. Starch is primarily composed of 2 different molecules,
Mm-hmm.
amylose and amylopectin.
And the ratio between those two completely dictates how your body digests the food.
Precisely. Let's look at 2 incredibly popular varieties that you'll find in almost any grocery store: basmati and jasmine.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because technically, jasmine and basmati belong to the exact same botanical subspecies family, right? The indica family.
I do, yeah.
But from what I'm seeing in the data, your bloodstream treats them like entirely different foods. Why is that?
Because over centuries, humans have selectively bred them for different traits, and in doing so, entirely altered their amylose and amylopectin ratios.
Ah,
Basmati rice naturally contains a high percentage of amylose, and at a molecular level, amylose is a straight, linear chain. It forms a very tightly packed, dense crystalline structure.
so if it's tightly packed, I'm picturing it like a hard-packed ice cube.
Yes.
When your digestive enzymes, which act kind of like little Pac-Men when they try to break it down,
Right.
they can really nibble away at the outside edges. They can't get inside the structure easily.
It physically resists rapid digestion because it takes so long for those enzymes to break it apart. The glucose trickles into your portal veins slowly.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right, and this gives basmati a low to medium glycemic index, typically sitting around 50 to 59.
So it's a slow, steady release of energy.
Mm.
But jasmine rice is different.
Jasmine is completely different. It was specifically bred for that beautiful floral fragrance, and it's soft, sticky, pillowy texture.
Which everyone loves.
Of course. But to achieve that stickiness, the amylose was basically bred out of it, and it became extremely high in amylopectin.
And how does amylopectin change the digestion?
Well, amylopectin is not linear at all. It is a highly branched, open, kind of chaotic molecule.
Okay.
Because it has so many branches sticking out, your digestive enzymes can latch onto it and attack it from hundreds of different angles all at once.
So if basmati is the ice cube, jasmine is like a loosely packed snowball.
Oh, perfect analogy.
You drop that snowball in water and it just dissolves instantly.
It literally melts into your bloodstream. That instant enzymatic breakdown is why jasmine rice has a shockingly high glycemic index, ranging anywhere from 68 all the way up to 91.
Oh, up to 91.
Yeah, it hits your system almost as fast as pure sugar.
That is a profound difference just from choosing a different bag at the grocery store. I mean, swapping jasmine for basmati fundamentally changes the demand you put on your pancreas.
It really does.
But what if I'm listening to this and I already have a massive bag of jasmine rice in my pantry? Or I just vastly prefer the taste of sticky rice? How do I protect my blood sugar then?
Then we step out of the grocery store and into your kitchen. We have to talk about thermodynamics.
Okay.
The way you prepare the rice can physically force those branched amylopectin molecules to behave more like the tightly packed amylose molecules.
You're talking about the refrigerator hack I mentioned at the very start of the deep dive.
I am.
Okay, explain how temperature actually restructures the food. This is crazy.
It starts with the cooking process, which is something called gelatinization.
The Latinization, okay.
When you boil rice, the combination of intense heat and water causes the starch granules to literally swell and burst open.
Like popcorn.
Kind of, yeah. This makes them incredibly soft and wildly accessible to your digestive enzymes. That's why fresh, hot rice spikes your blood sugar so aggressively.
Okay, so the heat bursts the structure wide open.
Got it. Right. But, and here's the hack, if you take that cooked, gelatinized rice and you cool it down in the refrigerator for 24 hours at around 4 degrees Celsius, a process called retrogradation occurs.
Retrogradation. What is physically happening to the starch during that?
As the moisture leaves and the temperature drops, the starch molecules begin to realign.
Okay.
They fold back on themselves and crystallize into a rigid, tightly woven lattice structure. They literally physically change shape.
That is wild.
And when they form this rigid lattice, they transform from a highly digestible starch into what we call resistant starch type 3.
And it's called resistant because our digestive enzymes literally cannot fit into that new lattice structure to break it down.
Exactly. Your human enzymes bounce right off this, so it passes completely undigested through your small intestine and travels down to your colon.
Wait, so it doesn't turn into sugar?
Nope. Down in the colon, it actually acts as a fermentable fiber, feeding your beneficial gut bacteria.
So you're telling me that by just putting my cooked rice in the fridge for a day, I'm literally converting a percentage of its carbohydrates into dietary fiber?
You are. Clinical trials show that this cooling process increases the resistant starch content from about 0.64 grams to 1.65 grams per 100 grams of rice.
That's a huge jump.
It is. And incredibly, that new crystalline structure is heat stable.
Wait, really?
Yeah. You can reheat the rice the next day for dinner, and the resistant starch largely survives.
Oh, that's amazing.
This simple thermodynamic hack reduces the glycemic response of the rice by roughly 18%.
That is mind-blowing. The literal temperature of your kitchen appliances dictates the glycemic load of your meal.
It's all chemistry.
But, our sources also highlight that we rarely eat a bowl of plain naked rice.
Right, exactly.
And what we pair with it fundamentally alters how our bodies process it. The literature calls this the food matrix effect.
Which is really just a scientific way of saying that your stomach is a mixing bowl, right?
Yeah.
Foods do not digest in isolation.
Right.
When you eat rice, what you eat alongside it dictates a mechanism called gastric emptying, which is basically the rate at which your stomach releases food into your small intestine.
So if the stomach releases the food slowly, the glucose enters the portal vein slowly.
Exactly.
How do we slow it down?
One of the most effective ways is actually through acidity.
Acidity.
Yeah, think about traditional sushi. Sushi uses a short grain, highly sticky, low amylose rice.
Right, which we just learned is like the snowball.
Right. By all accounts, it should spike your blood sugar into the stratosphere. But sushi rice is traditionally prepared by folding in rice vinegar.
Ah. And how does vinegar change the digestion?
The acidity of the vinegar physically tightens the valve at the bottom of your stomach, severely delaying gastric emptying.
Wow.
It holds the rice in the stomach longer. Adding vinegar can lower the glycemic index of a bowl of rice by 20 to 30%.
That is fascinating, 20 to 30% just from some vinegar.
Yep.
And it's not just vinegar. Right. I mean, if you eat that rice with a piece of fatty salmon, some fibrous broccoli, or protein-rich tofu, those macronutrients take a lot of complex work for the stomach to break down.
Exactly.
So the stomach holds on to everything, including the rice, for longer. The fat, the protein, and the fiber basically act as a metabolic brake on the rice.
It's a perfect example of empirical science hidden in traditional cuisine.
Totally.
Cultures developed over millennia didn't have continuous glucose monitors, but they inherently figured out these metabolic breaks. They knew to pair high glycemic starches with fermented vegetables, vinegars, and proteins.
Okay, so we have completely hacked the blood sugar issue.
Right.
We buy high amylose basmati, we cool it overnight to build resistant starch, and we pair it with a metabolic brake like protein or vinegar.
Perfect.
But if you are someone who eats rice multiple times a day, every single day, there is one more critical contaminant in the clinical data that we have to address.
Yeah, we need to talk about heavy metals, specifically inorganic arsenic.
Arsenic, obviously a known poison, and definitely not something you want in your dinner. Why is it in rice?
It's an environmental reality based on how the plant actually grows.
Okay.
Rice is an aquatic plant cultivated in flooded paddies. When soil is flooded, it creates an anaerobic or oxygen-free environment.
Right.
This specific chemistry changes the state of naturally occurring arsenic in the soil, making it highly mobile and water-soluble.
And the rice plant just soaks it up.
Yeah, the root system acts like a sponge, efficiently absorbing this arsenic right out of the water, far more than dry land crops like wheat or oats.
And arsenic is a bioaccumulator, right?
Yeah.
Meaning your body struggles to get rid of it, so it slowly builds up in your tissues over years, posing a long-term cancer risk.
Exactly. And while it's a concern for adults eating massive volumes, the sources aggressively emphasize that this is a critical issue for infants and pregnant women.
Right, because rice cereal is overwhelmingly the very first solid food introduced to babies. If a baby and an adult eat the exact same amount of arsenic, the baby's tiny body weight means their exposure ratio is exponentially higher and obviously much more dangerous.
Which is why regulatory agencies have really strict thresholds for infant rice products.
Right.
But if you're cooking standard rice at home for your family every day, there is an evidence-based mitigation strategy you can do on your stovetop to basically strip the arsenic out.
The sources refer to it as the pasta method.
Yes, the pasta method.
And I have to be honest, I read this and immediately thought of my friends who are incredibly particular about their rice cookers. Like, cooking rice like pasta feels like a cultural and culinary crime.
Oh, it completely violates the traditional absorption method.
Right, where you carefully measure 2 cups of water for 1 cup of rice, so every single drop is absorbed.
Right. But with the pasta method, you completely ignore those ratios.
Okay.
You cook the rice in a massive rolling boil of excess water, like a 6-to-1 or even 10-to-1 ratio of water to rice.
Why so much water?
Because the inorganic arsenic in the grain is water-soluble. When the intense heat of boiling opens the pores of the rice grain, the arsenic leaches out.
Oh, I see.
But it needs somewhere to go. If you use a massive excess of water, you create a concentration gradient that continuously pulls the arsenic out of the grain and into the surrounding water.
And then, when the rice is tender, you pour the whole pot into a strainer, physically draining all that excess water and the arsenic straight down the sink.
Yes, you must discard the water. By washing the rice thoroughly beforehand and then boiling it in a 6-to-1 ratio and throwing away the water, clinical tests show you can reduce the inorganic arsenic load by 40 to 60%.
Wow. I know throwing away the cooking water sounds, sacrilegious to a lot of people, but a 60% reduction in heavy metals is undeniably massive.
It really is.
If you're feeding rice to a toddler every day, throwing away the water is just a fundamental safety mechanism you have to adopt.
It does sacrifice some water-soluble vitamins, particularly if the rice was fortified, but for daily heavy consumers, and especially for young children, the long-term clinical trade-off of removing that heavy metal burden is absolutely worth it.
So what does this all mean for you listening?
Yeah.
Let's distill all of this chemistry and data into an action plan.
First and foremost, do not fear white rice.
Yes.
The global mortality data proves it is not inherently toxic or dangerous. Treat it as high-octane fuel that simply requires intelligent management.
Right.
If you eat it regularly, try to choose high amylose varieties like basmati or parboiled rice. If you are actively trying to manage your blood sugar, use the thermodynamic cooling hack.
Refrigerate it overnight.
Exactly, to restructure those starches into gut-friendly digestion-friendly fiber. Never eat it in isolation. Always pair it with a metabolic break like vinegar, fiber, or protein.
And finally, if it is a daily staple for your family, utilize the pasta boiling method to aggressively drop the arsenic levels. It's all about context and preparation. You can totally enjoy this global staple. You just have to outsmart it in the kitchen.
You do, but there is a lingering concept here that I think is truly profound, and it goes far beyond just a bowl of rice.
Oh, I'd love to hear it.
Think about the magnitude of the refrigerator hack we discussed.
Yeah.
The mere act of changing the physical temperature of a cooked grain, simply cooling it down, alters our hormonal response to it so drastically that it drops the glycemic impact by nearly 20%.
It's incredible.
It proves that our metabolic health isn't just dictated by a spreadsheet of ingredients or calories. It is dictated by the microscopic physical structure of the food itself.
It completely shatters that whole calories in, calories out
Yeah.
simplicity. A carbohydrate isn't just a carbohydrate, its actual shape matters.
Exactly. And it leaves you with a slightly unsettling question. If simply cooling a grain of rice completely rewires how our digestive enzymes interact with it,
Yeah.
what other ancient familiar foods in our modern pantries have had their molecular structures secretly altered by modern high-heat, high-pressure industrial processing? We might be inadvertently confusing our metabolisms right under our noses. We obsess over reading the ingredient labels, completely ignoring the shape-shifting physical reality of the food itself.
That is a brilliant thought to leave on. The molecular shape of your food dictates your health just as much as the substance. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structure of what's on your plate, and we'll see you next time.